It's July 8, 2022, in the Mediterranean Sea. The USS Harry S. Truman is in the middle of a routine resupply when the sky turns black without warning. Winds slam the ship out of nowhere, and in a matter of seconds, an F-9 Super Hornet, a jet worth roughly $67 million, gets ripped straight off the flight deck and disappears into the water. It sinks 9,500 feet to the bottom of the sea. Gone. Just like that. One sailor working nearby was hurt in the chaos. No one saw it coming, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it once the wind took hold. That's the danger sitting on top of every single aircraft carrier in the world, every single day. A single F-18 Super Hornet costs around $70 million. A modern carrier can hold more than 60 of them at once, along with other aircraft worth just as much or more. Add it all up, and you're looking at over $8 billion in fighter jets, sitting exposed on a flat steel runway, in open ocean, with absolutely nowhere to hide when a storm rolls in. So how does the most powerful navy on Earth keep billions of dollars in aircraft from becoming very expensive ocean debris? Stick around, because by the end of this, you'll never look at a flight deck the same way again. And here's a question for you. If you had 2 hours to save $8 billion worth of jets from a storm with 150-mile-per-hour winds, what do you think would go wrong first? Drop your guess in the comments, because the real answer might surprise you. Before we get into how the Navy protects these aircraft, you need to understand exactly what's sitting on that deck. A modern Nimitz-class carrier is a floating city worth roughly $8.5 billion. The newer Gerald R. Ford class runs closer to $13 billion, but the ship itself is only part of the bill. Each carrier can carry between 60 and 90 aircraft, a mix of F-8 Super Hornets at around $70 million each, E-2 Hawkeyes running about $80 million, and the newest F-35C stealth fighters costing tens of millions more on top of that. Do the math, and you're easily looking at billions of dollars in aircraft alone, parked wingtip to wingtip on a runway that never stops moving. None of these jets sit randomly. Every single aircraft has an assigned spot, tracked constantly by handlers below deck, using a scale model board that mirrors the real flight deck piece by piece. And hurricane season runs from June through November every single year. Carriers can't pull into a garage and wait out a storm. They operate around the clock no matter what the ocean throws at them, which means every single deployment eventually runs headfirst into weather nobody can control. Every aircraft on a carrier has built-in tie-down points, reinforced metal rings near the nose wheel, and main landing gear, specifically engineered to handle extreme loads. On a calm day, each jet gets secured with a handful of heavy chains. But the moment storm warnings go out, that number jumps dramatically, sometimes more than doubling, especially for heavier aircraft. Picture that scene for a second. Winds are already gusting well past 40 miles per hour. Ocean spray is crashing 60 feet up onto the deck. And in the middle of all that, a small team of sailors, most of them barely in their 20s, are running from jet to jet, wrestling steel chains into position, tightening every single one by hand. Each aircraft gets its wings folded first, a feature built specifically for tight deck storage, shrinking a jet's wingspan by more than a third. Then the chains go on in a cross pattern, forward and aft, port and starboard, so the aircraft can't slide in any direction no matter which way the ship rolls. The sailors doing this work are identified by colored jerseys that tell you their job at a glance. Yellow shirts direct aircraft movement. Blue shirts handle the tie-down chains. Purple shirts fuel the jets. Red shirts manage weapons and crash rescue. Every single person on that deck has one job, and in a storm, there's no time to explain who does what. You already know, because you've drilled it 100 times before the real thing ever happens. One sailor described the job simply: chaining down a jet in hurricane winds feels like trying to leash a bucking bull, except the bull weighs over 30,000 pounds and costs more than most people's entire life savings combined. And if even one chain is left loose, or one fitting fails under pressure, that jet doesn't just get damaged. It becomes a multi-ton missile, sliding across a deck packed with other aircraft, fuel lines, and sailors who have nowhere to run. There's no room for shortcuts in this process, and everyone on that deck knows it. A final checker walks the line after every aircraft is chained, verifying each connection by hand, because a chain that looks tight from a distance can still have just enough slack to fail under the right gust. In true hurricane conditions, that number of chains can nearly triple, with sailors working in teams against a ticking clock. Because once the storm actually arrives, going back out onto that deck to fix a mistake simply isn't an option anymore. Not every aircraft can survive a storm exposed on the flight deck, which is exactly why every carrier has a hangar bay, essentially a massive garage built 2 decks below. This space is enormous. It runs roughly 685 feet long, more than 2/3 the length of the entire ship, and stands about 25 feet high and 110 feet wide. That's big enough to hold more than 60 aircraft at once, tucked safely behind thick steel walls, protected from wind, rain, and crashing waves. Sliding fire doors divide the hangar into separate zones, originally designed to stop a fire from spreading, but during a storm, those same doors also add extra structural protection, so if one section takes damage, the rest of the hangar stays secure. When a storm approaches, the air boss makes the call, and whatever aircraft can be moved below deck gets moved below deck immediately. 4 massive elevators, each one powerful enough to lift 2 74,000-pound fighter jets at the same time, work non-stop, shuttling aircraft down from the flight deck as fast as the crew can secure them. Every cockpit canopy gets closed, every access panel gets checked and double-checked. Maintenance crews move fast, because once that storm actually hits, there's no time left for a second pass. But here's the hard truth nobody likes to admit. Space in that hangar is limited. Not every aircraft fits. Priority goes to the most expensive, most mission-critical jets first, the F-35Cs, most of the Super Hornets. That means some aircraft, along with helicopters and support planes, simply have to stay topside and take the storm head-on, chained down as tightly as physically possible, and left to weather it out in the open. That decision, choosing which multi-million-dollar aircraft gets a spot below deck and which one gets left exposed, isn't made casually. Officers weigh mission needs, maintenance status, and sheer dollar value in a matter of minutes, knowing full well that whatever gets left topside is now gambling against the storm itself. It's a strange kind of triage, not for people, but for machines that cost more than most small towns' entire annual budgets, decided under pressure by sailors who don't have the luxury of a second guess. Sometimes, even with every procedure followed, things still go wrong. And the July 2022 incident aboard the USS Harry S. Truman is proof of exactly how fast it can happen. The carrier was in the middle of an at-sea resupply, a routine operation where a ship pulls alongside to transfer fuel and cargo, when what the Navy later called unexpected heavy weather hit without warning. Intense wind and heavy rain slammed the ship in a matter of minutes. One sailor was injured, and an F-18E Super Hornet, worth roughly $67 million, was simply lifted off the deck by the wind and thrown into the Mediterranean Sea. It took weeks for Navy salvage teams to locate the wreckage, sitting 9,500 feet below the surface, and even longer to recover it, partly because losing sensitive onboard technology to a rival nation's ships was its own serious concern. That single incident is a reminder that no matter how many chains, how much training, or how many procedures exist, the ocean can still move faster than a crew can react. It's part of the reason the Navy takes storm preparation as seriously as it takes combat readiness itself. Because on a deck worth billions of dollars, there's no such thing as an acceptable margin for error. What makes that day especially unsettling is how ordinary it started. Underway replenishment, transferring fuel and supplies from one ship to another, while both are moving at full speed, happens constantly during deployment. It's routine, drilled hundreds of times, rarely dangerous on its own. But weather at sea doesn't always announce itself the way it does on land. There's no radar tower nearby, no local news warning of a squall line forming. Sometimes a patch of ocean simply turns violent within minutes, and a crew that was following every procedure correctly still ends up watching a $67 million jet disappear over the side. It's a humbling reminder that even the most disciplined Navy on the planet is still, at the end of the day, at the mercy of the sea. Every modern storm procedure the Navy uses today traces back, in one way or another, to a single, brutal night off the coast of the Philippines. In December 1944, during World War II, Admiral William Halsey's Third Fleet sailed straight into a violent typhoon nobody saw coming in time. Winds tore through the fleet at well over 100 miles per hour. 3 destroyers capsized and sank outright. Nearly 790 sailors lost their lives, most of them trapped inside ships that simply rolled over and never came back up. Aboard the light carrier USS Monterey, the storm rolled the ship so violently that parked aircraft in the hangar bay broke loose from their restraints and slammed into each other like pinballs, igniting a fire that killed 3 sailors and injured dozens more. A young officer aboard that ship, serving as the general quarters officer of the deck that night, was ordered below to assess the blaze and report back to the captain. That officer's name was Gerald Ford, decades before he would become President of the United States. The Monterey survived, badly damaged but afloat, and every lesson learned from that single night about tie-downs, about hangar bay design, about respecting a storm's power long before it arrives, still shapes the procedures carriers follow today, more than 80 years later. That's the strange truth about military tradition. The chains, the training drills, the strict color-coded roles on deck, none of it exists in a textbook by accident. It exists because sailors decades ago paid for those lessons with their lives, and the Navy swore it would never make the same mistakes twice. Even the way modern carriers position their hangar bay doors, the redundancy built into their tie-down fittings, and the sheer paranoia with which today's crews approach any hint of severe weather can be traced back to nights like that one. Somewhere in every storm briefing given aboard a modern carrier, whether the sailors realize it or not, there's a quiet echo of December 1944, of aircraft breaking loose and slamming into each other in the dark, of a young officer sent below to face a fire he had no way of knowing he'd survive. History like that doesn't just get written down, it gets built directly into steel, procedure, and muscle memory, carried forward by every single generation of sailors who come after. Storms aren't always the only threat a carrier faces, and the Truman's most recent deployment proved exactly how brutal it gets when both hit at once. During the 2024 to 2025 Red Sea deployment, the Truman had to secure aircraft for rough weather while simultaneously defending against Houthi missile and drone attacks, sometimes within the same few hours. Crews would chain down jets for an incoming storm, then rush to unchain and launch aircraft for an emergency response, then resecure everything all over again once the threat passed. Over the course of that single deployment, the carrier lost 3 FHA-18 Super Hornets. One was mistakenly shot down by a Navy cruiser in a friendly fire incident, forcing both aviators to eject. Another was lost when a tow crew lost control of it inside the hangar bay, and it rolled off the ship entirely. A third went into the sea after failing to catch the arresting wire during a nighttime landing. None of those 3 losses were caused by a hurricane, but all 3 happened inside an environment where crews were stretched thin, juggling weather, combat, and routine operations all at once, which is exactly the kind of pressure that turns a small mistake into a multi-million-dollar loss. It's a sobering reminder that protecting these aircraft isn't only about surviving nature. It's about maintaining that same level of precision every single day, whether the threat is a hurricane or an incoming missile. Because on a modern carrier, there often isn't time to choose which crisis to handle first. Investigators looking into these losses often find the same underlying thread, not a single catastrophic failure, but a string of small ones stacking up under pressure. A break that wasn't checked as thoroughly as it should have been. A communication gap between the bridge and the hangar bay during a high-stress maneuver. None of these things sound dramatic on their own, but when a carrier is simultaneously dodging missiles and managing rough seas, there's simply less margin to catch a small mistake before it becomes an expensive one. That's the reality of operating in a modern conflict zone. The weather doesn't pause for combat, and combat doesn't pause for weather, which means the crew has to be ready for both, all the time, without exception. Securing the aircraft is only half the story. The carrier itself has to survive the storm too, and it's engineered to do exactly that. Modern carriers are built with a center of buoyancy positioned higher than their center of gravity, which means that the farther the ship tips in rough seas, the stronger the force pushing it back upright becomes. Combined with a wide, flat hull beneath the waterline, it creates one of the most stable floating platforms ever built, even in violent weather. During an actual storm, the standard protocol is to turn the ship directly into the wind and maintain forward speed. It isn't optional. Steaming into the wind reduces the relative force hitting the deck and keeps the bow facing incoming waves instead of taking them broadside, which is when ships become genuinely vulnerable to capsizing. On the bridge, the captain, the air boss, and senior officers track wind speed, wave height, and storm trajectory constantly. Using real-time satellite data and reports from Hurricane Hunter aircraft, Air Force Reserve crews, who fly directly into the eye of major storms, just to gather data no satellite alone can capture. Every hatch and door on the ship gets sealed during severe weather, turning the carrier into a nearly airtight steel shell. Any water that does make it onto the deck has to drain immediately, because pooled water below deck can cause a dangerous listing effect that has capsized far smaller ships throughout naval history. None of this happens by accident in the moment. Storm procedures get drilled into crews long before a real hurricane ever appears on radar, practiced during calm seas, so that when the real thing hits, nobody is thinking, they're just executing. Officers on the bridge run through scenario after scenario, deciding in advance how the ship will respond to different wind speeds, different wave heights, different angles of approach. By the time an actual storm shows up, the response isn't a decision anymore. It's muscle memory, built the same way a pilot's hands know a cockpit switch without looking. At the end of the day, none of this happens because of steel, chains, or clever engineering alone. It happens because of the sailors standing on that deck, in conditions most people will never have to imagine. These are mostly young sailors, many barely out of their teens, working in temperatures that can exceed 120 degrees in the Persian Gulf, or facing North Atlantic winds strong enough to knock a grown adult off their feet. And still, they move aircraft, check chains, and perform maintenance while the deck pitches and rolls beneath them, like a small boat in open water. Training for this never stops, even during calm weather, because when a real storm finally hits, there's no time left for hesitation or second-guessing. Every sailor already knows exactly where to stand, exactly what to grab, and exactly who to trust standing next to them. That trust is really what this entire system runs on. A sailor tightening a chain has to trust that the sailor next to him is doing his job with the same urgency. The bridge has to trust that the hangar crew below understands exactly what's happening topside, and every single person on that deck has to trust decades of hard-earned lessons, many of them paid for in past storms and past losses, that got baked into procedures long before any of them were even born. It's worth remembering that most of the sailors doing this work are barely old enough to rent a car back home. They didn't grow up dreaming about tie-down chains or hangar bay logistics. Most of them signed up wanting to serve their country, and ended up becoming the last line of defense between a $70 million jet and the bottom of the ocean. That responsibility, handed to sailors who are still, in a lot of ways, just kids figuring out adulthood, is easy to overlook from the outside. But it's the actual engine behind every single number in this story. So the question was never really whether these carriers can survive a storm. They're engineered, drilled, and trained to do exactly that. The real question is how they manage to protect billions of dollars in aircraft while staying combat ready around the clock, in every ocean, in every kind of weather nature can throw at them. And the answer isn't just steel chains or hydraulic elevators. It's generations of hard lessons, from a typhoon in 1944 to a single storm off the Mediterranean in 2022, all distilled down into procedures that sailors half their commanding officers' age now execute from memory, under pressure, without hesitation. Every chain tightened, every jet moved below deck, every hatch sealed shut, is a small act of respect for every sailor who learned these lessons the hard way, long before anyone alive today ever stepped foot on that deck. Because at the end of every storm that passes without a single aircraft lost, nobody throws a celebration. The crew simply moves on to the next task, the next watch, the next storm somewhere over the horizon, quietly protecting billions of dollars in steel and circuitry, with nothing but chains, training, and the kind of trust that can't be bought at any price. So really think about that question again. 2 hours, a $70 million jet, and winds strong enough to flip a car. What do you think would actually go wrong first? Tell us in the comments. And if this pulled you into a world you never knew existed, subscribe, because there's a lot more happening on that flight deck than most people ever get to see.